So today I'm going to talk about a movie that I posted on my Facebook page. If anybody is a Facebook follower, they can find it. I can't give you the address because it's too long to memorize, but if you email me, I'll be glad to send you the address. And you can find my email on my website, kusala.info, or Facebook page, kusala@outlook.com, or I guess that's a good start. Okay, so what's this movie about? This movie is about a monk, Chinese monk. His name is Xuan Zang. I'm thinking that's how you pronounce it. Xuanzang. This movie was made in 2016 and made by the Chinese government. And they spent a lot of money and they have really good CGI and it's done really well. And it's about a monk who went from China to Nalanda University to pick up Buddhist texts, and then he brought them back to China. So I thought it really intrigued me. Now it's 2 hours, so it's an investment of time. And it took him 19 years to go there, get the texts, and come back. And during those 19 years, he was put in prison. He was prevented from going. He almost died in the desert. There's like all sorts of stuff that he went through. And I'm thinking, how lucky are we to go to Amazon and instantly get that book that we want? 5 seconds, 10 seconds, download. There you go. 19 years. So when he finally made it to Nalanda University, he hooked up with a Theravada Mahayana group, I'm assuming. Because the teachings that they were teaching in the movie were definitely Mahayana teachings, and they prayed to Amitabha Buddha, so not Shakyamuni. But in Nalanda, they had Mahayana and Theravada. They had come together, and it was a major university, and it lasted until around the 11th century, and Muslim invasion sort of wiped it out. So, I'm watching the movie, and then they're going to go into debate. The various schools and teachers and students are now going to come together by invitation of the king, and they're going to debate. And the debate is, what is the difference between Mahayana and Hinayana? Now you can tell that question was formulated by the Mahayana, calling the Hinayana the small vehicle. Today, the Hinayana is the Theravada, doctrine of the elders. So we have Theravada and Mahayana, and they're going to come together and talk about the difference. Well, the monk, Xuan Zang, was identified as the one who was going to go and debate. He had the answer. And in the debate, he won. And he got to ride an elephant. And I thought, yeah, those were the good old days. When you won, you got an elephant, you know. And so I thought to myself, this is like the best question. Because a lot of people wonder what the difference is between Mahayana and Theravada. So I will give you my explanation of the difference between Mahayana and Theravada. Mahayana is a Buddhist school that arose around the 1st century. It is contributed, it was said that Bodhidharma went from India to China to start the school, the Zen school in particular. So Mahayana, doing what the Buddha did. Theravada, doing what the Buddha said. That's where it starts. Like that one? Yes. So we have, okay, what did the Buddha do? The Buddha was a bodhisattva. Now, up until the Mahayana, the place of a bodhisattva wasn't particularly important because it was the Buddha before he became the Buddha. In his many lifetimes, before he was born as Siddhartha Gautama, he was a bodhisattva. And what is a bodhisattva? A bodhisattva is someone who postpones his own nirvana to save others from their suffering, and once everybody is saved, then he'll accept his nirvana. So if you follow the Jataka tales, Siddhartha Gautama was reborn at least 550 times until he became Siddhartha, and the Buddha at age 35. Now, what is the difference between a Buddha and an Arhat? Well, there are 4 levels of nirvana: stream enterer, non-returner, stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and Arhat. An Arhat is the 4th level, and it is the same realization as a Buddha. So if you're an Arhat and you have a Buddha over here, you both have the same realization. What identifies the Buddha from an Arhat is the Buddha did not have a teacher. He, through his own effort and wisdom and compassion, realized his nirvana and then was able to teach. An Arhat is someone who listens to the teachings of a Buddha and then achieves nirvana. So same level of realization, one had a teacher, one didn't. Okay. Now we come to the 1st century, and we have the reform movement known as Mahayana. And the reform movement says the Theravadins, Hinayans, small vehicle, were very selfish. They only thought about themselves. We are not going to think about ourselves. We're going to think about everybody else first. And we're going to encourage everybody and show everybody how to achieve their nirvana, and then we'll achieve ours. So that was the idea. The idea was to become a bodhisattva, like the Buddha did in all his previous lifetimes, and then ultimately become a Buddha. Now, when I first heard this concept of becoming a Buddha, I thought to myself, well, on earth there's only one Buddha at a time. So this is the 28th Buddha, according to Theravada tradition. Siddhartha Gautama became the 28th Buddha. We have to wait for his teachings to die out, and so far they've been alive for 2,600 years, until the next Buddha will come to earth and turn the wheel of Dharma. Now the next Buddha is Maitreya Buddha. We already know who he is. He's in Tusita heaven and is waiting his turn. If we want to become a Buddha, we'd have to wait at least till Maitreya's teaching had died to the world, and then perhaps be reborn on earth from Tusita heaven and be the next Buddha. It's a lengthy process. Eons go by. Mahakalpas, they call it. But the Mahayana had an answer for that. It said that it's not just being a Buddha on earth, it's being a Buddha everywhere. Even on a dust mote, the one that falls that floats in the air and shines in the light. That's a world system. And you can be a Buddha on that world system, on that dust mote. So there's plenty of work to do, plenty of places that Buddhas need to be. And if you so aspire, you have a place of business. But not the earth. Okay. So now, imagine, if you will, Nalanda, and they're going to have this debate, this dialogue. And so what's the difference? What's the difference? Well, number one, nirvana, as I define it, is the end of suffering, the end of karma, and the end of all future rebirth. It's a simple, down-to-earth definition of what nirvana is. The most exciting part about that definition is the end of karma. Because karma is the very thing that migrates from lifetime to lifetime. And if we can end our karma, we'll never have to be reborn again. Now that may not sound exciting to you listening to this talk, but every time we're born, we end up getting old, if we live long enough, we end up getting sick, and then we end up dying. Every time. And there's no way out other than nirvana. And nirvana is unborn and undying, so it can't be created, it can only be realized. The Mahayana say, we're not going to end our suffering, we're not going to achieve nirvana. Our enlightenment is different than the Theravada's nirvana. So what is enlightenment according to me? It's the direct experience of the interconnectedness and interdependence of all phenomena. It means that we have an epiphany and see and realize the connection we have with all things. And in that moment, their suffering becomes our suffering. And that, I think, is the beginning of the Bodhisattva ideal, realizing how we're all connected and realizing that anyone who is suffering, hungry, or homeless in the world is literally a part of us now. And our job is to not make their life better, but to reduce their suffering. It's a small distinction, but an important one. So we realize that no matter how hard you try to make the world a better place, it never gets there. It's permanently flawed. But we can reduce the suffering of those who are in this world with us. And so that would be the way a Buddhist would go after the suffering, and not making the world a better place, or not even making their life a better life. Sometimes it's just a matter of coming to a place of acceptance with what's going on that reduces the suffering and ultimately ends the suffering. For me, this has always been a challenge because at this center we've always had Theravada and Mahayana. We've always had two distinct ways of looking at the Buddhist path and the end result, enlightenment, nirvana. Eightfold Path is found in both of them. But the being prepared to save all sentient beings through a vow is an amazing way to say, I'll never achieve nirvana. Because we've been working on saving all sentient beings for 2,600 years, or at least since the first century. And we have more people suffering rather than less. So how do we wrap our head around taking a vow to save all sentient beings and realizing that you'll never actually accomplish that? Well, I think the Buddha, for some reason, after all his many lifetimes, found that the life of Siddhartha was the time he could realize his nirvana. And perhaps for a lot of us, we end up being in the bodhisattva mode lifetime after lifetime until the conditions arise that are necessary for our nirvana, our realization. And the Eightfold Path enables us to put some of the conditions necessary to work for us to achieve our nirvana, the end of suffering, the end of karma, the end of all future rebirth. But we can never create nirvana. We can create conditions necessary for nirvana to be realized, but we can't create nirvana. And if you've been on the path for a while, you start to realize the goal becomes less important than the path. That the path is what you do every day. And the goal is something that may or may not happen. So it sort of goes to the back burner. And that's one of the most exciting parts for me as I look at my life and say, well, what's my goal? And actually, there isn't one any longer. Now it's just, what am I going to do today? What am I going to do in this moment? What needs to be done? Is it going to reduce suffering? Am I going to be skillful in the way I respond to the world around me? And so this ideal of nirvana is no longer the carrot dangling in front of me. It's now, okay, it's what I do that's important, it's not who I am. Which can be confusing as well, but that's another talk. So now we have the Mahayana and the Theravada, and in the movie, the Mahayana said the difference is the Theravada is for one person, and the Mahayana is for everybody. And I thought to myself, yeah, it sounds like that initially, but when we approach reduction of suffering, some people prefer to end their own suffering, and some people prefer to help others end their suffering. But if we're all interconnected and interdependent, whether I'm trying to end my suffering or their suffering, it's working for both of us. But sometimes it's easier to work on yourself than to work on your family. And it's funny when you talk to people who have this bodhisattva ideal, well, have you started with your family? And they would say, no, I can't do that. I'm going to start with the people I don't know first. Because I know too much about my family. And I know I'll never win and never change the mind. And you go, yeah, that's sort of how it works. We start with people that we don't know, and then we sort of get to people that we do know, and then we sort of get to ourselves. Or we start with ourselves, and then we go to our family, and then we go to all the people that we don't know. But they both end up doing the same thing to the person practicing, allowing them to realize their place in the universe, if you will, their place on this planet, their place in their community. And we were talking earlier about the diversity of community. In LA, we have so many chances to practice because it is such a diverse neighborhood that we live in. No matter where you live in LA, generally speaking, you'll find somebody who doesn't speak English. You'll find somebody who went to school in a different country. You'll find somebody that has hair or doesn't have hair. You'll find age groups and cultural groups and education groups and all living together. And then you say to yourself, well, what's the best one? And there isn't one. You come to the place where everything is just the way it's supposed to be, and there's no better or worse. There's just different. And yet, somehow, in the difference, we find our connection. We're still connected to all those people in a unique way. Now, if you come to our meditation, you'll find the connection often happens in silence. That when we're silent, no differences exist. But as soon as we open our mouth, 10,000 things prevent us from seeing it the same way. So silence is a good way to find the connection. You can find it through compassion and activity. Many ways to find a connection. And it keeps changing, and there's always more than one. And that allows us to feel comfortable in the diversity eventually. Okay, so back to our problem. What's the difference between Mahayana and Theravada? Basically, it's a cultural shift from India to China. Taoism and Confucianism were sort of blended into Buddhism. And the idea of this monk going to Nalanda was to bring back the true teachings to China. He felt that the teachings in China at that point had been either misunderstood or misinterpreted or were not the original teachings of the Buddha. And he wanted to do that. He wanted to bring back the original teachings. So, what happens to us when we want to learn Buddhism? Where do we start? Well, a lot of us start in Theravada. A lot of us start with, what did the Buddha say? In fact, there's even a book, What the Buddha Said. And we sort of get our foundational teachings in early Buddhism. Then, if we're lucky enough to find other teachers, then we go into the Mahayana and maybe even the Vajrayana and see how it's been interpreted, see how culture has shifted the way we understand the teachings of the Buddha. And then we find the thread. Is there a thread? And the word sutra is sutra. Suture comes from sutra, the thread. Is there a thread that connects the Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana? Is there some connection between all three schools? And if you can find the thread that connects the schools of Buddhism, you can listen to any teacher and see how it is related to the Buddha and his teachings. That's the challenge. But we start with one, we expand to maybe two or three, and then we see the differences, but we also see the similarities. And we see the core teachings aren't really changed at all. As I'm fond of saying about the different schools of Buddhism, we all have the same father, just a different mother. And that allows us then to hear what we're able to hear You know, I gave a talk last week at Against the Stream, and there was a fellow there with his wife, and he hadn't heard the teachings of the Buddha, and he was surprised that we were so interested in finding the end of suffering, because suffering is just part of life. And so some people can't hear the Mahayana, but they can hear clearly the Theravada. I was one of those. I started with Theravada, and I couldn't hear the Mahayana. To me, it always sounded like poetry and abstract concepts. But as I continued to meditate and continued to study, I saw in the Theravada what the Mahayana were talking about. So I was able to then read some of the Mahayana sutras and appreciate what they had to say and see how they were connected to early Buddhism. I had always wanted to be an arhat. That was my goal. I was going to meditate, I was going to read the sutras, I was going to follow the teachings of the Buddha. And I kept getting distracted by people calling me up saying, can you help us with this, can you help us with that, can you join our team, can you be part of this, can you be part of that. So after 20 years of community service, I realized that this lifetime was probably not the lifetime I was going to realize nirvana. That I was going to end up suffering until I died. But maybe others would suffer less because of my community service. Sometimes we don't have a choice in our path. Sometimes the path chooses us and we don't choose the path. And when I started, I chose the path, but then the path chose me. And I continued to work and study and practice. And now I find myself doing less and less community service and more personal service. Books to read, meditation to lead, things to reflect on, life well lived, life not so well lived, all the things that you start to think about when you get really old, and try to put into a context that's understandable. So going from the Theravada, what the Buddha said, now what the Buddha did, trying to end my suffering and my karma and all future rebirths, going into the direct experience of the interconnectedness and interdependence of all phenomena, which can happen at any time, not just in meditation, but it can happen on the beach, it can happen on the sidewalk, it can happen on the freeway. All of a sudden we just have that sort of connected feeling, and oftentimes we think we're getting the flu or some serious illness is happening. It goes away quickly and never to appear again. Everything only happens once, but something else happens, and then something else happens. And then we start to see the suffering. And when you start to see the suffering, there's no place you can go where you don't see it, which is sort of uncomfortable. There was a wonderful commercial, I think it's a Kia commercial, and they're out in the forest, and they're driving their four-wheel Kia, and there's a river and the pine trees, and the man and the woman get out and say, this is just so beautiful and so peaceful. And all of a sudden an eagle comes from the sky, gets a trout, and flies away. And they're both in a state of shock. How could something so cruel happen in such a peaceful surrounding? And that's what you start to see when you get on this path, is you start to see the eagles and the fish, you know, and you go, wow, even in this peaceful, wonderful place, there's eagles and fish, and life and death, and everybody's hungry. And there's a giant food chain, and we're at the top, thankfully. So we don't have to look around for the eagles that are coming after us. And when that happens, the bodhisattva ideal is not that far-fetched. It makes sense. It seems to be an appropriate way to live. And then it becomes not who you are, but simply what you do. You don't identify yourself as an arhat or a bodhisattva, or sometimes even a Buddhist. You identify yourself through what you're involved in doing, the things that are making a difference in the world. And the people that are making a difference in the world are people that do things, not become things, I think. So if I were there in Nalanda giving my talk, debating and dialoguing with the other people, what's the difference between Mahayana and Theravada, I would say ultimately there's no difference at all. That the mind finds the differences, relates to them, chooses side, picks a team, until transcendence of that occurs. And it does occur if one stays long enough. That you're identified as a Buddhist, as a upasaka, upasika. You're identified as a monk, novice monk, fully ordained monk. You keep all these identities, and yet you keep outgrowing them. And eventually there's no identity that you need to carry with you. That your response to the world is appropriate at all times. And you don't have to role play to get the right response. So I can highly recommend this movie if one wants to be thoughtful about Mahayana. And this fellow found it and posted it on his YouTube channel. And I don't know what the fellow's name is either, so I can't, but I can, if you email me, I can do that. Or if you go to Facebook page, Facebook, you can see it there too. It's a picture of a monk.
Was it in English or was it?
It has English subtitles.
So what was the original language? The Chinese?
Chinese. Okay. It was made in China.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yes, sir.
I think I understand what you're saying about focusing more on action rather than becoming something. But don't our actions, I mean, traditionally, being thoroughly Western myself, actions are thought of as the results of who you are, like your character. If you're a generous person, you do generous deeds. You're a selfish person, you never share. And so I'm attracted by what you're saying, but I'm trying to figure out, so what do I do? Like, what actions do I do if I don't think about who I am? Mm-hmm. Or where are these actions coming from? Like, how do they get generated?
Good, yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. We're taught to be somebody so we can do something. We're taught that a CEO does more than a CFO, or maybe not more, but it's different. So you become that, and then you have these activities that are connected with that identity or that role playing. So in Buddhism, they just annihilate any idea of what a self could be. They just tear it apart. It's name and form, it's the 5 aggregates, it's the 32 parts of the body. It's never one thing, and it's never really who you are. It's just something you relate to that allows you to have an identity to live separately in an interconnected way. So for a Buddhist, what would you do? How would you identify action if you're not somebody? And it really starts at a very basic level with the 5 precepts. So Buddhists would take the 5 precepts. And you don't need to be anybody, maybe other than a Buddhist, to work on the 5 precepts, but even Christians, Jews, and Muslims can carry the 5 precepts and hold them. So what's the 5 precepts? Not to take life, not to take what is not given, not to indulge in sexual misconduct, not to speak unskillfully, not to consume intoxicants. So that would be your reference point and your foundation for action. What you're doing when you accept the 5 precepts is you're changing your karma. The karma is everything we think, say, and do. And the 5 precepts work on saying and doing. Then, as a meditator, we would pick our object of meditation and change how we think. And in changing thinking, saying, and doing, we're changing our karma. We're doing something in response to the world. Or you might say we're not doing something in response to the world, because Buddhism is a path of renunciation. So we really don't gain anything, but we get rid of a lot of stuff that prevents us from realizing our own perfection. Now, if you're like a Zen guy, they don't want to be identified with anything. There's just a big circle, and that may or may not be who you are. So can we, use the various identities we have, the various roles that we play, husband, wife, brother, sister, son, daughter, can we use those various roles and reduce suffering by making people feel comfortable with the identity they think we have? And go, sure. So when my mother was alive and I would go visit her, she'd always want me to take out the trash, because she's always wanted me to take out the trash. But that was a mother and son role, and I accepted it without any hesitation. And I said, sure, Mom, I'll take out the trash. Now, I was a different guy. She was a different woman. The trash was still being taken out, but it was role-playing, and it was done for a reason, to establish a relationship again. And that was fine. I didn't have to be that person except in that moment, you know. And I did it because it made her feel good. So if I'm speeding and they want to see my driver's license, it makes the officer feel good if I give him my driver's license. If I say I'm not going to give it to him, it makes him feel bad, and then he might decide that I need to go in and think about it in the jail cell. You know, so there are certain roles that we need to play, but we have the option of not having to be that person any longer than is necessary. The relationship defines who we are. The relationship with a police officer or your mother defines who you are. And when you go into a restaurant, you're a customer. And when you go to pay your taxes, you're a taxpayer. And so you have all these different roles. But Buddhism says it's just a role, it's not who you really are. The idea is to say to yourself, well, what am I really? Who am I really? Is there any kind of essence or personal identity that doesn't change, that's independent? Or is it more of a process, a conditioned process? When certain conditions arise, the process manifests in a certain way. And when those conditions are taken away, there's another process that manifests. And it continues and continues and continues like the river flowing. So can we be the water in the river and not have to take any shape at all? I take care of the koi pond and back in the meditation center. And one of the hardest parts about taking care of a koi pond is controlling the water. Because it's always leaking or evaporating, or there's too much and there's overflow. And it doesn't have its own shape. It takes the shape of the pond. And if I change the shape of the pond, it changes its shape. And we're sort of like that too. We change shape depending on what pond we're in now. And so the activity comes initially from who we are or who we think we are. But ultimately, the activity can just happen in response to the world. Was that useful? All right, thank you. Okay. Anything else? Jeannie, how about you? Do you have a question?
No.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Well, I think we've done it. I've done it as best I could. And thank you all for listening. And we're going to do a little chanting now and tea and cookies. Thank you.